Hello, sixth graders. So we're up to chapter 6. And so once again, if you just open your book and follow along with me, David tramped on and on. He was so familiar with the first part of the way that the darkness did not trouble him. He had often been along that road with the children. He told himself he would take his shoes off as soon as it was morning, for he had noticed while he was in the house that the shoes wore out, and it would be a good thing to save the shoes for later on when it grew colder, or he was forced to travel at night when he could not see the stones. He thought, too, about the route he had to take. He would have to go into a town called Florence, for of course he had no food. Luckily he still had a lot of money given to him by the American he had fetched the petrol for, so he had no need to stop in the town to earn more. But thinking about food for any length of time made him feel uneasy, for then he found himself thinking about milk and vitamins, and from there he would go on to wonder whether he might perhaps be an important hostage. But he had learned a lot from his stay in the house. The globe. He must remember to think about the globe all the time, so that he would not forget where Andre and Maria had pointed. He must get to Switzerland first, and then he would come to Germany, and finally to Denmark. His clothes were a great help, too. They were much better than the ones he had had before, and there were more of them. They would help a lot now that it was growing cold during the nights. Yet his thoughts remained heavy and depressed, in spite of his recalling all the added advantages he had gained from living in the house. And as the days went by he felt no better, although all the places he came to were just as beautiful as those he had passed through before he came to the house. There were beautiful round green hills and valleys and rivers and trees of all kinds. Everything looked the same as before, and yet seemed different. For the first few days he dared not risk traveling by car. He would not try asking for a lift until he was a long way from the house. He made haste to leave Florence, too, although there were so many things to see there. A great river with a great bridge over it, and on the bridge a narrow street complete with old houses on either side, and there was a square with big statues in it, and a church that looked like David could find nothing to compare it with. It was so beautiful. While he had been living in the house, he had heard that there were places in Florence where there were thousands of magnificent paintings that everybody could see, and he would like to have gone to look at them. But the great thing was to get far away from the house as quickly as he could. The farther away he went, the more difficult would it be for them to discover which way he was going. So far, no one had questioned him. As long as he had money to buy bread, he had no need to talk to the tourists, and they were the ones who always asked the most questions. The Italians only wanted to know what he was called and where he was going. David was very careful what he said about the circus now. If only he could find out where he had shown his ignorance, as the children's mother had said he had. In spite of everything, he still thought it was the best story he could find. He thought often of what the children's parents had said about him. He was a little upset by it, but not very much, for he had known all along that he was not like other boys, and that there was something about him that people found strange. But he did not think the children's mother had explained very clearly just where he was different. His manner of speech, for instance. He had, of course, heard many Italians speak somewhat differently, but then the children's parents spoke just as he did, just like the Italian priest in the concentration camp, and the French he spoke was certainly good French, for that was Johannes's own language, the language David was so familiar with that the French word would often occur to him before he could remember the Italian, and as Johannes, who was wiser and better than anybody else, spoke French in that way, then it must be the proper way. Perhaps that was the trouble. Perhaps you shouldn't speak well if you were a tramp. But if that was what the children's mother meant, then she was wrong. The way you spoke was a reflection of how you thought, and that could not possibly have anything to do with whether you were a tramp or whether you had somewhere to live and had many things of your own. And as for hating, as for hating Carlo, yes, it was true enough, he did, and when he thought about it, he could well understand the children's mother not liking it, for of course she did not know Carlo was bad. But there was nothing to be done about it. He could not have stopped hating Carlo, not even if Maria herself had begged him to. You must always hate what was bad, or else you grew just like them. No, there was nothing he could do to put matters right, except by making a complete change in himself, and that he would not do. He must always be true to himself. He would beg a lift the next day so that he could get quickly to the town called Bologna, for since leaving Florence the mountains had become quite high and it was taking him longer to go uphill. David began to think about Switzerland. There he would find lofty mountains without trees, capped with eternal snow. That much he understood from Andre when they had looked at the globe together. but he seemed unable to direct his thoughts properly. They were full of heaviness and foreboding, so that nothing felt right. Just before the bend in the road he had noticed a small town not far ahead, and he now decided he would try to pluck up enough courage to go into the church. The houses had a friendly look about them, and the hour was about noon, when there was hardly anyone in the streets. David remained standing in the open space that was always to be found in front of a church, and wondered if he dared. His mood of depression was the result of his having entered a house, but not a church. But a church was not a house, of course. No one lived there, and he had wanted for such a long time to see what a church was like. A church was a place where you talked with God. In Italy, of course, he could only find the God of the Roman Catholics, but still, suppose his own God were on a visit there, and suppose he really met him. But perhaps gods did not visit one another. A faint hope that he would find some comfort there drove him inside. The door was heavy. Even in small towns like this one, the church was always big, and the door was just as heavy in the front as the front door of the house where he had been staying. He had to push hard to open it. The light inside was subdued. David remained standing just inside the door until his eyes had grown accustomed to the change from the bright sunlight outside to the soft obscurity within. It was very quiet and beautiful. It reminded him a little of the house, though in many ways it was very different. There were paintings and carved woodwork and colored glass in the windows. In front of some of the paintings, along the side of the church, candles were burning. But the silence was not complete. David's eyes, now accustomed to the dim light, perceived a dark figure kneeling before one of the paintings. The man was saying something very softly. David crept quietly toward him. If it were someone praying, he wanted to listen. He might learn something, but he could not understand the words. It was Latin, and apart from a few words, he knew no Latin. The figure rose. "Good day, my son. Are you looking for something?" "No, sir," replied David politely. He stepped back hastily and glanced over his shoulder to make sure where the door lay. "You need not be frightened of me. As you can see, I'm a priest." David realized he was right. Priests always wore long black gowns outside the concentration camp, and a priest was never one of them. David ceased looking toward the door, and he looked at the painting instead. "Is that your God, sir?" "No, that's St. Christopher." "He's not a god?" "There's only one God, my son." David frowned. That wasn't right. He knew there were several. "What are you called, my son?" "I am David." "So you're David, and who's your God, David?" "He's the God of green pastures and still waters." The priest looked at him and smiled. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." It's the same God, David. David had listened attentively. He loved the sound of the strange words that people did not otherwise use, and the priest seemed quite familiar with his God. "It can't be the same one, Signor. He was the God of someone who was also called David." "Yes, that's right. The words I spoke came from the 23rd Psalm of David. I gather you must be a stranger, and you don't belong to our church. But believe me, David, it's the same God. We men call him by so many different names, but when we pray because we need help or comfort, it's still the same God that hears our prayers." Perhaps what the priest said was true. How could he be sure, when there were so many things he did not know? But when you made a choice, then you must stand by it, even if your choice concerned God, and if the priest were mistaken, you mustn't let yourself be influenced by it. "I'd rather keep my own God, if you don't mind, Signor. He's very strong and helps you when you're frightened, and you shouldn't change your mind once you've made your choice, for you must respect what you've said." David said this very politely, for he did not want to hurt the priest's feelings. But the priest did not seem to mind in the least. He continued to smile, and David said in a voice so gentle that it sounded almost like Johannes, "You are perfectly right, David, and you've chosen well. You shall certainly not want. Do you know what you want? Do you know what want means?" "Yes, it's the same as being in need, but I like the other word better. It sounds more like music." David no longer felt sure it was quite so simple as that. People were often in need, but they had to do something about it themselves. They could not get something for nothing. David thought the priest was going to put his hand out toward him, and he stiffened. But he was wrong. The priest did not touch him, but merely said, "I'm going home for something to eat, David. If you're hungry, you can come with me, or perhaps I can help you in some other way." David considered. A priest was never dangerous, and it would be foolish not to accept help in finding out what he wanted to know. "Thank you," he said. I'm not hungry, but if you have a map that shows what Italy looks like, then I'd like to see where Switzerland begins." Beyond Bologna, the countryside was less beautiful. The landscape was practically flat, and the road gray and dusty. Some of the byroads might have been more picturesque, as David had discovered they often were, but he was in a hurry, and there was more traffic on the main roads. He had written down on a piece of paper the names of the towns he must pass through on his way to Switzerland, and as it was growing a little bit colder every night, David only stopped when he ran short of bread. He had now spent all the money he had started with, and it was only in the towns that he could earn more money. But there were no longer so many tourists to be found, and David wondered if they would all go back home when the weather became really cold. If they did, he would be in danger of starving, for the Italians were able to do most things for themselves and did not need a boy to help them. Moreover, although he was by this time a very long way from the house, the thought never left him that they might have put the police on to him, and so he considered it safer to keep away from Italians, except for motorists and truck drivers. They were quite safe. They had no time to be interested in strange boys. They were too fully occupied with thinking where they were going and what they were going to do when they got back home. As long as you listened to what they told you about themselves and their families, they were satisfied. They always said how nice it was to have someone to talk with, but David thought they really meant talk to rather than talk with, for there was never any need for him to say much more than yes or no. But that suited him. As long as they were only interested in themselves, there was less danger of their asking him too many questions, and they nearly always shared their food with him. Then there was the driver who had introduced David to railway stations. He had very often seen trains, but it had never occurred to him that they had definite stopping places or that there were such things as stations. That was before he got to Milan. The man he had been riding with had asked him something or other about the circus, and David had told him he had been taken ill when they were in Naples, and so he was now alone on the roads on his way to join the circus again. The man inquired if he had enough money, and when David replied that he occasionally earned a little, the man apparently thought he was in the habit of doing it at railway stations. So when he arrived in Milan, David went in search of the station, and what a good way of earning money it was. The people who were boarding the trains or getting off them were often in need of someone to carry their cases, and at the station there were still many tourists to be found who did not know Italian and were glad of someone who understood what they said and could find out what they wanted to know, like asking which platforms the trains were due to go from or where the restaurant was. David spent a whole evening at the station and earned enough money to buy bread for several days. It was there he saw the paper. He was no longer interested in newspapers. Whenever he came across one or had the loaf he bought wrapped in one, he would read what was in it to practice reading quickly, but much of it was about things he knew nothing of, and in any case he had no means of knowing how much of what he read was true, especially when he did not know who had written the articles. If they had written them, then it was best not to believe them. Suddenly he saw his own name. He had been sitting on a seat for a little rest, for the last case he had carried had been very heavy, and he was tired. An Italian was sitting beside him, and when he got up to go, he left his paper lying on the seat. And there, on the back page, he read, "David, do not be afraid. We are not searching for you, but we should be glad if you would come back and live with us. We believe everything you said, the children's parents." It was addressed to him, there was no doubt about it, and for a little while he felt quite happy. It was cold in the ditch. He dared not to try to beg a lift in the evening because people thought it was wrong for a boy to be on the roads at that time. It had taken him a long while to leave Milan. Behind, and now he could find nowhere to sleep but this ditch. It was a good thing he had grown used to being cold in the camp. Once more David thought about the letter in the paper, and he was glad they had written to him. They were good people, all of them, except Carlo. Yet he knew he could not go back. He would always hate Carlo, and he would always be different and out of place, and he would not be able to tell them what they wanted to know, for if he did, they would be forced to send him back to them. Suddenly David knew why nothing had seemed quite right since he had left the house. He recalled how uneasy he had felt, as if he had gone up the broad front steps the first day he was there, as if some danger lay in wait for him behind those doors. If only he had gone on his way and never entered the place. He had been happy before. Yes, happy when he had lived among the rocks, and while he was tramping the roads. He had been his own master, and could do as he pleased. He had had the beauty of the countryside all about him. He had enjoyed the taste of bread and fruit, and he could wash whenever he wanted, and go where he would. But when he entered the house, his old way of life lost some of its value. He had seen what he could never have, and nothing would ever again appear quite so good and satisfying as it had done before he had learned of the existence of that other life. Even if he had not hated Carlo, even if he had dared to go back, it would not have helped matters. The children and their parents belonged to one another, and David could never belong. He was not right. He was different from other children who had not been brought up in a concentration camp. There was nowhere he belonged. Now that they no longer believed he was really bad, they would do their utmost to make it appear that he did belong. But it would not be the truth. He would continue to be himself. David, a boy who had been fugitive and did not know where he was fleeing to. He should never have entered the house. Maria, whenever he had looked at Maria, and she brought a smile to his lips, he had been aware that there was something he had forgotten, something important. He had forgotten the most important condition that made it possible for him to go on living, that he should never again grow fond of anyone. When Johannes died, he thought he would die too, but when he had recovered and knew he was not going to die, he realized he must never, never care for anyone again. Never. Only if you were indifferent could you go on living, and that was what he had kept in mind through all the years that followed. But when he saw Maria, it was forgotten. And now nothing would ever be as it was before. Even if they were good, even if they were not looking for him, even if he would preserve his liberty and could avoid being too cold or too hungry, it would never be the same again. Another boy had appeared, one who was not different from the rest, one who felt he belonged to a place and to people, one who was loved by someone he could love in return, and yet he would always have to remain himself. God, he said, God of the green pastures and still waters, I am not praying for help, because I am David, and that's something that can't be altered. But I want you to know that I've found out that green pastures and still waters are not enough to live by, nor is freedom. Not when you know there's love, and you haven't anyone you belong to because you're different and are only a boy who's run away. I'm saying this to tell you, you needn't help me anymore to escape from them. It doesn't matter. Thank you for your time. You helped me when I still thought life might be worth living. I am David. Amen. David could not remember when he had stopped crying. He had not cried since Johannes died, only that first day in Italy and the day among the rocks, and that was the only water running from his eyes, not from sorrow or sadness, as it is when you are crying properly. He must have fallen asleep in the end, for when he looked about him again, it was morning and the sun was shining. It must have been shining for some time, for he was no longer perished with cold as he had been during the night. He felt completely tired. A feeling of exhaustion seemed to go right through him. He got up, picked up his bundle, and started to walk. He might just as well walk as sit there and wait. He thought of nothing in particular. There was no longer any need to think, now that he did not care what happened. He took it into his head, however, to find his way around the frontier post. He did not know why he was doing it, what they called instinct, perhaps, or the urge for self-preservation. Whatever it was that made men strive to go on living, even when they knew it would be better to die. Or perhaps it was because the scenery had become beautiful again. When he had reached the place called Como, he had found the mountains once more. The town lay on the shores of a large blue lake, surrounded by magnificent mountains, and people were laughing gaily in the streets. The frontier lay in the next village, and David knew at once he was not going to like it. There was a barrier across the road and soldiers who examined people's passports before they were allowed to drive on. It all looked very friendly, and no one seemed to be afraid. They all had their papers in order, of course, and so they were allowed to proceed. But David did not like the look of it. He had to be, if he had to be arrested, then it would be in the beauty of the mountains, not here at a road barrier. He made his way out of the village again and along a narrow by-road, and not until he had been walking for an hour did he turn northward, away from the road. He had learned in the concentration camp that this was the way to cross a frontier. At some point where no one could see you. Sometimes you were caught in spite of that, but then it was by chance and not because there was a barrier there. For a long time he tramped on, away from the road, up over the vineyards, keeping as nearly in a northerly direction as he could reckon from the position of the sun. It was hard going, but he wanted to be quite sure he had crossed the frontier before he took to the roads again. Then he came to a village called Mendrisio, and immediately concluded he had gone astray, for the people in the street still spoke Italian. But then he saw a notice over a doorway with the word Svizzero on it and a flag that was not the Italian flag. Svizzero, he recalled, was the Italian word for Switzerland. So they spoke Italian in Switzerland too. David decided to take the road again. It was only the barrier that he wanted to avoid. He knew nothing about Switzerland, not a thing. There had never been a Swiss in the camp. Pure luck, perhaps, not that it mattered now. Late in the afternoon he came to the lake again, or it might have been another lake. It was very beautiful, almost as beautiful as the coast where he had lived among the rocks. Dotted up and down the mountainsides lay gay little villages, and boats were sailing on the lake. After he had walked along the shore of the lake for some time, the road ran over a bridge to the other side of the water. The next town should be called Lugano. He would buy a loaf there, and perhaps some cheese as well. But David did not reach Lugano. The road lay between the mountains and the edge of the lake, and a little above the road he caught sight of an orange tree. He began to scramble up the hillside to see if there were any fallen oranges. He found one and stood there gazing down at the lake, which looked very beautiful from up there. He made his way among the trees still farther up the slope, and there he sat down on a low wall that had been warmed by the sun. He took out his knife and began peeling the orange, gazing now and then at the lake below. "Hello, boy!" David turned around to look. He did so quite calmly, for he did not mind who came now. Then he stood up. It was a woman. The children's father always stood up when their mother entered the room, and he made the boy stand up too. "I'd like you to let me paint you, if you've time." David looked at her. "I've plenty of time," he said politely, "but I don't know what it's like to be painted. Where do you want to paint?" The woman had begun putting something on an easel. A case was standing at her side. "Here," she said. David walked over to her and looked at the easel. "Oh, I didn't know you wanted to paint a picture. Can you paint beautiful pictures, Signora?" The woman laughed. "No, they're terrible. But just trying is something, isn't it? You always go on hoping that one day you'll manage it." "Yes, but one day you may realize you'll never be able to." The woman looked at him as if she were going to say something, but David felt sure that what she did say was not what she was going to say. She merely asked if he could sit still. David said yes, and she laughed and said she was sure that was a lie, but a quarter of an hour later she begged his pardon. He obviously could sit still, but he could move his head and talk now if he wanted to, as long as he kept the rest of his body still. David answered politely that he had nothing to talk about, and the woman did not appear to find anything odd about that. She went on painting and left David to watch her at his leisure. She was not a young woman, but she was not old either. She was thin, and David did not really know whether he liked the look of her. She was not Italian, for she did not speak the language properly. She could say anything she wanted to, but she did not always know which words took masculine endings and which feminine. Her hair was quite fair, and her eyes were gray. She was not pretty or good-looking, and yet there was nothing about her face that was unpleasant, and she was intelligent. You could always tell from people's faces whether they were intelligent or not. David decided that he could find nothing against her. She did not think it necessary to question or talk to him, and when she said anything, she spoke properly, not in the silly manner some people adopted when they were speaking to children, as if you were bound to be stupid just because you were a child. Several hours went by. The sun sank lower and lower, and the shadows grew longer. Suddenly the woman said, "You're a fool, boy. Why didn't you say it was late? You must be dead beat with all this sitting still." "No, I don't mind," David replied. "Well, if you're hungry, you'd better help me pack up, and then we can go home and get something to eat." She lived in a beautiful house. It was not very big, but it shone with a fresh coat of yellow color wash. It had green shutters and little balconies outside the windows, and there was a garden all around it with cypress and palm trees. The inside of the house was very attractive too. Pictures and other interesting things hung on the whitewashed walls, and the furniture was very fine and quite different from anything David had ever seen before. The woman said he could set the table while she prepared a meal for them, if he could manage it, that is, but he was not to break anything. It was fun. The children had often said something was fun, and David had never quite understood what they meant. But being left alone in a beautiful room to find the right things to put on the table and setting them out to his liking, that was certainly fun. "Heaven preserve us!" exclaimed the woman as she came in. David had not been able to find a white cloth, nor were there any silver plates to put under the ones you ate from, but he had discovered a piece of cloth the color of the mountains where he had lived by the sea, and something between red and brown. The woman had attractive plates, and her knives and forks were silver. She had beautiful fine glassware, too, tucked away at the back of a cupboard. And David had placed one of the 2 candlesticks from the chest of drawers at one end of the table, and there was a black bowl beautifully shaped which David had set beside the candlestick. He had picked a pink flower from outside the window and laid it in the bowl. "Where did you learn to set a table, young man?" David looked at her. "I like it to look pretty. I mean beautiful when I eat," he said seriously. "I beg your pardon. I'd no intention of being nosy, and you're perfectly right. What one does every day should be done beautifully. It's very sensible and proper." Yes, she was a clever woman. She had noticed that he had not given her a direct answer. David was gradually growing to like her better and better. They talked of many things while they ate, food and furniture and colors, and she never once seemed surprised by anything he said. She spoke to him as if he were a person who understood what she was saying. David decided to ask her all the things he wanted to know. He would not tell her where he came from. He would just ask questions. It no longer mattered if he aroused suspicion, and it would be a good thing to risk asking questions, just for once, without wondering if he were giving himself away. But no matter what David asked about, she told him what he wanted to know without asking him anything in return. Finally, David said, "Is there a king in Denmark?" "Yes, there is. I must see if I can find a picture of him. How did you know I was Danish?" "Of course, you probably live down in the village." "No, I didn't know you were. I only wanted to know whether there was a king." "Well, I am Danish, anyway. My name is Sophie Hartmann." "I am called David." The woman had not asked him, but he thought it was only right that she should know who he was when she had told him who she was herself. "David," said the woman. "One rarely hears that name outside England. Do you think it's an English name?" "No, it comes from the Bible. Most names do originally. It's found in many places, but I've only known one person of that name myself, and I never actually saw him." David looked at her with interest and waited for her to tell him more, but she said hastily, "There's no reason why I should tell you about that. It was a very sad story, a story of great wickedness." So they spoke of other things. She showed him a magazine with a big picture on the front cover, a photograph of the King and Queen of Denmark. David examined it closely. The king was wearing a uniform with epaulets on his shoulders and many orders on his breast, and the queen looked like a woman in a painting, dressed in a long sleeveless gown that revealed her beautiful arms. On her head she wore a large piece of jewelry. "Well, do you think it's a good photograph?" asked Signora Hartmann. "I don't know what a king and queen ought to look like," David replied, "but they don't look like people who would break their promises or think they had a right to take other people's lives or freedom away from them, so they must be all right. Thank you for showing them to me." David lay in a bed again that night. Signora Hartmann had told him he could stay overnight if he had nothing else to do, and then spend the next day with her. David had told his tale of the circus. He did not like telling it, but what else was he to say? And he had to say something when she asked if he was expected anywhere. It had been interesting to talk with her. If it had happened before he had decided life could never be worth living, his meeting with her would have given him a lot of pleasure and satisfaction. He was beyond caring now, but she had beautiful things around her, and it was beautiful by the lake, so he might as well spend the day there. She had to go to Rome the next day, she had told him. David found it difficult to go to sleep. He was not quite so miserable any longer. After all, he had always known it did not matter whether you died or not. It was only after he had made his escape that he had come to think he really did want to live. But he could not get back to his old habits. He went on turning things over in his mind. He could no longer think of nothing as he had trained himself to do in the concentration camp. When he awoke the next morning, he could hear the Signora talking to someone, and he decided to stay in bed until she was alone again. They were speaking in French, and the other person was a man who wanted her to go out sailing with him. She told him she could not because she had a visitor, a boy she was painting. The man asked if it was one of the youngsters from the village, and the Signora said no, he belonged to a circus, but she did not add, as David expected, that he was a strange boy. She said, "Someone's broken his spirit." The man said that a boy's spirits were not easily broken, and the Signora replied that she did not think it had been done easily, but they had succeeded in the end. The man thought she ought to do something about it. If the child was really wretched, he said, and was wandering about by himself, it was their duty to inquire into his circumstances and help him. But the Signora only said, "What can one do to help a broken heart? And as for his circumstances, I've no right to interfere. He could be given money so that he could go by a train to join his circus, or wouldn't have to walk. But neither you nor I have any money to spare, Pierre, and it won't do the boy any harm to walk. Anyway, I gather his thumbs lift most of the way. That's what they generally do these days." When the stranger had gone, David went downstairs and found the Signora had breakfast ready for him. Then he sat for her again, and while they were resting after lunch, she said he could look through her books. He did not settle down to reading anything, however. There was a large photograph album on the bookcase. There were photographs from many countries, and some of them had the names of places written underneath. There were photographs of people as well, and in many of them he could recognize the Signora. Some of the pictures lay loosely in the album, and from the back of the book one bigger than the rest fell out. David did not know how long he had been sitting with it in his hand when the Signora came in. "Who's that?" he asked when he saw her, and he showed her the photograph. "That's a friend of mine. She's called Edith Hort Fengel. Will you tell me about her?" "What for?" "Because her eyes look as if she'd known a great deal, and yet she's still smiling." "You're a sharp boy, David. Her story's mostly a sad one. She lived abroad with her husband in a country where the political situation made it necessary to be very careful, and her husband wasn't. One night the police arrested them, all three of them, her husband, herself, and their little boy, who was then only a year old. He was the one who was called David, just like you, and whom I never saw. They killed her husband and the child, and Edith only got away because one of her guards was in love with her. He got papers for her and smuggled her across the frontier, and now she lives in Denmark and is as well as you can be when you've once been through a great unhappiness. All suffering has an end, David. If only you wait long enough. Try to remember that. Sorrow has its life just like people. Sorrow is born and lives and dies, and when it's dead and gone, someone's left behind to remember it, exactly like people." So that's the end of chapter 6. David has a new clue about the man and the origins of his mother and why maybe he needs to go to Denmark. So chapter 7's up next. Thanks a lot.